After 8 years of development and billions of dollars spent, the US Navy is canceling its Constellation-class frigate program, an effort that was meant to produce maybe as many as 58 warships in the coming decades, easing the burden on America's large surface combatants like the Arleigh Burke-class of guided missile destroyers, and helping to offset China's significant and growing numerical advantage in the Pacific. According to Navy Secretary John Phelan, the Navy will now pivot toward what he called new classes of ships that can be delivered in greater numbers and on a more urgent timeline. But then, that is exactly what the Constellation-class was meant to be. The whole idea was to give Uncle Sam's seafaring force something of an off-the-shelf solution to its diminishing ship number problem, retaining some 85% of an existing French-Italian frigate design while incorporating existing American hardware to produce a small but highly capable vessel that could provide a meaningful boost in firepower to large formations like carrier strike groups, or stand and swing all on its own in both blue and green waters, meaning in the open ocean or in coastal areas. But now, nearly a decade since its inception and 5 years since a production contract award, near constant design changes and shifting naval priorities have turned this off-the-shelf solution into more of a custom-made money pit. And it's one the Navy has no intention of keeping on their roster. But then throwing away the billions invested into this ship to start the design process all over again doesn't seem like a very effective way to save any time or money either. In a lot of ways, deciding to cancel the Constellation-class frigate or not was sort of like deciding between two different crap sandwiches. Neither is all that appetizing. So let's talk about the Navy's decision to do away with its new frigates and whether or not America can find a way out of this shipbuilding hole that it's dug. I'm Alex Hollings, and this is Firepower. If you're over 21, I've got something really cool to share with you. Winglore whiskey. A few fighter pilots with a love for great whiskey and even better stories set out on a mission to bottle the best in bourbon and American single malt, and what they created is Winglore, a craft-driven, aviation-inspired whiskey brand built around premium quality and a community of storytellers. Or as they put it, Winglore's all about the rowdy camaraderie, the lighthearted roasting, and the epic stories that are at least 10% true. And when I read that, I genuinely couldn't help but chuckle and think about my own late nights in the barracks. So if you're over 21, you can learn more about Winglore's team, their whiskey, and the story behind their brand by visiting the link in the description below. And if you're curious about their bigger mission, you can also check out their Join the Squadron page, which explains how supporters can become an official part of the Winglore journey, including all the eligibility details and legal requirements to do so. Again, this is for legal drinking age audiences only, but if that happens to be you, well, Winglore has a pretty awesome story behind it, and a lot more awesome stories to tell. The US Navy divides its surface combatants into two categories of warships. The first is the one you're probably most familiar with, large surface combatants, or LCSs, like the Arleigh Burke-class of guided missile destroyer and the larger Ticonderoga-class guided missile cruiser. Now, the second category, appropriately enough, is small surface combatants, or SSCs, which include ships like America's Independence and Freedom-class littoral combat ships, its Avenger-class mine countermeasure ships, and various types of patrol boats. And up until the 2010s, that second category also included some 51 Oliver Hazard Perry-class frigates, which, despite being small surface combatants, weren't really all that small. The largest of these ships were 454 feet long, 45 feet across, and displaced some 4,200 tons. Now, that is roughly 2 to 3 times the size of many World War II destroyers. And while these ships offered little in the way of air defense, these ships still gained a reputation for being tough, dependable, and when necessary, for being able to swing well above their weight class. Not only were these Perry-class vessels well suited for maritime interdiction and general presence operations on the open ocean, their towed sonar arrays and embarked helicopters made them very capable sub-hunters, and their Mark 13 missile launchers made them pretty darn capable escorts too. In fact, these frigates proved so handy that when America retired the last of its in-service Perrys in 2015, more than 30 of them were purchased by allied nations who still have them in service today. Of course, the Navy's plan wasn't just to retire these ships without any viable replacements. Long before the final Perry's retirement, work had already begun on the Navy's new littoral combat ships, or LCSs, meant to absorb the frigate's coastal combat roles. But after 28 out of a planned 52 of these new ships were built, in 2 variants, the Freedom and Independence classes, the Navy canceled the effort due to rampant cost overruns, program delays, and some pretty serious mechanical issues. By the time the final axe came down on the LCS program in 2023, the Navy had already awarded a production contract to Wisconsin-based Fincantieri Marionette Marine to build an entirely new type of advanced frigate, the Constellation-class. Now, in order to expedite production and to keep costs down, the Navy opted to base this new frigate on an existing design, the Italian and French FREM multi-mission frigate that was already being produced in 2 variants, one for each of its developed nations. Now, the plan was to retain about 85% of that original FREM design while changing about 15% to better suit the U.S. Navy's needs and to meet Navy regulations. And while the old Perry-class frigate was hardy and utilitarian, this new Constellation-class frigate would be packed to the gills with enough 21st century hardware and weaponry to conduct many of the same missions assigned to destroyers today, thus freeing them up for more important work. The Constellation-class would pack 32 Mark 41 vertical launch system cells, about a third as many as you'll find on an Arleigh Burke destroyer. Now, each of those cells is capable of employing the same surface-to-air interceptors and surface-to-surface missiles carried by larger warships. We're talking SM-3s, SM-6s, and Tomahawks. Now, these cells would be bolstered by 16 canister-launched naval strike missiles, a 21-cell Mark 49 launcher carrying RIM-116 rolling airframe surface-to-air missiles for more close-in air defense, and a 57mm naval autocannon capable of unleashing 220 5.2-pound high-explosive projectiles per minute at targets more than 9 miles away. Now, all of this firepower would be queued using the newest Baseline 10 architecture for the same battle-proven Aegis combat system already found in American destroyers and cruisers and plenty of Allied warships to boot, pulling data from the new AN/SPY-6 V3 active electronically scanned array surveillance radar and the AN/SPS-73 V18 surface search radar. And that was far from all. A low-frequency variable depth sonar, multifunction towed array, and the AN/SQQ-89 V16 anti-submarine warfare combat system, along with an embarked MH-60R Seahawk helicopter, would make the Constellation a terrifying adversary for enemy submarines. While its unique combination of diesel, electric, and gas turbine propulsion would make its acoustic signature exceedingly tough to pick up and to target by those same subs. In other words, a very powerful but very quiet warship. Put simply, the Constellation-class frigate was meant to serve as something of an Arleigh Burke-class junior, carrying a lot of the same systems and weapons as the Navy's top-tier destroyers, just in a much smaller package that would, at least in theory, be cheaper to build and to operate. The Navy aimed to buy 20 of these new highly capable frigates at around $1 billion apiece, which when combined with development costs would place the entire first tranche of this program at around $22 billion. But hopes were so high for the Constellation that the Navy also intended to buy anywhere from 28 to maybe 38 more ships after that, in a more modernized Flight II configuration. But of course, cramming all that capability into what's meant to be a fairly small ship has a habit of, well, making it into a big ship. It wasn't long before the Navy decided to depart from the FREMM design to better accommodate all of its necessary hardware. Italy and France's FREMM frigates measure from between 434 to nearly 466 feet long, but America's new Constellation would add another 30 feet to the largest FREMM iterations, reaching 496 feet. Now this, of course, came with a substantial increase in weight, increasing from around 6,000 tons to 7,291. And as you might expect, making the ship bigger and heavier quickly became a problem, especially as the frigate's requirements continued to change too. For instance, in 2022, the Navy decided to cancel plans to install a new anti-submarine warfare module into its very troubled LCS ships, and instead to shoehorn it into the new Constellation-class as well, citing its ability to integrate well with the ship's existing SQQ-89 ASW combat system we mentioned before. Back in 2020, when the production contract was awarded, the Navy projected this first new Constellation-class frigate would be delivered in 2026. But by 2022, with construction underway on that first ship, the design was still not finalized. With design elements of the ship's structure, piping, ventilation, and other important systems still incomplete, production was forced to stall, driving up costs further. And by the following year, the weight growth issue was becoming just too big to ignore, with the ship's displacement growing by about 10% and already exceeding its maximum weight margin, really calling into question whether or not the ship could support any future upgrades at all. The Navy even considered reducing its requirements for the ship's top speed to sort of offset this added weight, but that called into question whether or not it could keep pace with fast-moving carrier strike groups that it was meant to escort. By 2024, the first ship of the class was 36 months behind schedule, with the second already considered 2 years behind, even though its keel hadn't even been laid yet. The plan, as I mentioned before, was to retain about 85% of that FREMM frigate design to expedite production, but by that point, the Constellation design retained only about 15% of that original FREMM design. Now, this caused a cascade of other issues, like the need to write new code for a reported 95% of the ship's control system software because of deviations from that FREMM design that it came from, along with the incorporation of a lot of new equipment and systems. To put it bluntly, the Constellation-class seemed to be suffering from a classic case of scope creep, a term that we use to describe a program that keeps seeing new requirements tacked onto it as it develops, resulting in cost overruns and technical delays. As one lawmaker put it, the Navy kept chasing a 100% solution to the point where they ended up with 0% of the ship being delivered. So, with all this in mind, it's pretty easy to see where the rationale came from to cancel this bloated and delayed frigate effort. The only problem with that rationale, though, is that it effectively means the Navy will now have to start from scratch to fill that void left in 2015 by the Perry class, after not one, but now 2 failed efforts to do so. And while America's struggling shipbuilding industry works to crack that nut, China's absolutely massive shipbuilding efforts are still moving ahead at full steam. While the US Navy does still outweigh China's in terms of gross tonnage, China's massive shipbuilding industry has allowed the People's Liberation Army Navy, or PLAN, to field an ever-growing number of large-hulled combat vessels, many of which are said to technologically match the combat prowess of some of the US Navy's most modern warships. Today, China's combined navy, maritime militia, and militarized coast guard, all of which fall directly under the command structure of the People's Liberation Army itself, accounts for more than 750 total hulls, outnumbering the American Navy by a factor of better than 2 to 1. And while China's Navy continues to grow, America's numbers are now beginning to decline, with current projections showing America's fleet strength shrinking by about a dozen ships between now and 2027, and those figures come from before the Constellation-class was canceled. Meanwhile, in 2023 alone, China reportedly added 30 ships to its fleet, 15 of which were large surface combatants, destroyers, cruisers, and the equivalent. Now, Chinese shipyards now account for more than 53% of the entire global shipbuilding market versus America's 0.1%. In fact, the China State Shipbuilding Corporation alone built more commercial ships by gross tonnage in 2024 than the entire U.S. shipbuilding apparatus has collectively since World War II. And the expanded shipbuilding infrastructure funded through these commercial endeavors allows for more naval ships to be built for less money and on shorter timelines for the Chinese Navy. Now, according to the Senate testimony of Navy Vice Admiral James P. Downey, the commander of Naval Sea Systems Command, the U.S. Navy currently has 92 ships under contract to be built, including 4 Constellation-class ships that were just canceled. Now, 56 of those vessels are at some stage of active construction, and across the board, actual ship deliveries are at an average of 1 to 3 years behind schedule. And production costs themselves are consistently rising at higher rates than inflation, meaning it's literally getting more expensive to build the same ships over time. Now, the same sorts of issues that affected the Constellation-class also plagued the construction of other ships, like America's new Ford-class supercarriers, with supply chain issues and complications related to new technologies, like electromagnetic aircraft launch and recovery systems, all pushing delivery of the second ship in this class, the USS John F. Kennedy, from this year to next year. The next carrier after Kennedy, the USS Enterprise, is already said to be about 28 months behind schedule, with its new delivery date now pushed back to 2030. The Navy's new ballistic missile submarine, the forthcoming Columbia-class, is suffering from similar delays, with the first ship of the class, the USS District of Columbia, now expected to be delivered 12 to 18 months behind schedule, sometime in 2029. And in keeping with cost trends, the first Columbia-class sub is now expected to come in hundreds of millions of dollars over budget, outpacing even the shipbuilder's own projections, according to a September 2024 report from the GAO, or the Government Accountability Office. Now, the CBO, or Congressional Budget Office, estimates that getting Navy shipbuilding back on track would require an investment of about $40.1 billion per year, every year, for the next 30 straight years, totaling more than $1 trillion overall. And that would mean increasing the Navy's budget by about 46% a year. But doing so would fund expanding American shipyards beyond the 7 commonly used ones today, staffing those shipyards with highly trained personnel, and expanding competition within the U.S. industrial base. After all, a good portion of the components that go into American submarines all come from single-source manufacturers. All told, the U.S. Navy is now in a really tough spot. Canceling the Constellation-class may have saved it as much as $20 billion over the next 10 to 15 years, and Navy officials have been clear that they hope to reallocate that money to other shipbuilding efforts. But even if canceling the Constellation-class was the right thing to do, which it very well could have been, it's still hard to imagine how starting over again will result in a lower price tag or a faster delivery date for a new ship design, while all the other overarching issues with American shipbuilding remain intact. Of course, there are lots of possibilities, including unmanned surface vessels, or arming former commercial ships with vertical launch system cells, and even some discussion of going back to building larger, more heavily armed and more heavily defended surface combatants, sort of like a 21st century battleship full of vertical launch system cells. But at this point, these are just ideas, and what the U.S. Navy needs now more than ever is action. So, how would you overcome the growing numerical warship gap in the Pacific? And how do you think American shipbuilding can get back on track, if not dumping $40 billion a year into it every year for the next 3 decades? Like all complex problems, the solutions are probably going to be equally complex, but I would love to hear what you think. And with that, ends this edition of Firepower from Sandboxx News. I'm Alex Hollings. Make sure to swing by sandboxnews.com today and every day for all the latest in news, entertainment, and now merch from all around the force. If you got anything out of today's video, make sure to click like and subscribe down below and leave me a comment so I know what I should cover next. And of course, don't forget to tap on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandboxx News.